welcome everyone to the last meeting in our 2026 programme. And I'm astounded at the speed at which this year seems to have passed. We're grateful to the Montgomery Trust, who this year, as last, are sponsoring one of our speakers. And that speaker is John Daniels, who's going to talk to us tonight. John was born and brought up in West Wales. He did give me the Welsh words for describing this, but I'm not running the risk. He's never been to Canterbury before, but at one stage he lived in Bangor, and some of you, like me, may remember Canon Donald Alchin, and John was friendly with Donald when he was in Bangor. His background is in science, in which he gained his doctorate, and he then worked as a software engineer before being ordained into the Church of England. His most recent post was as local ministry officer and warden of readers in the Diocese of Hereford. But then he decided that he wanted to try and focus on some long-term interests and to finish a book which has just been published, copies of which are on sale in the foyer at a much reduced price. It's a multidisciplinary theological reflection on the mess we are currently in. Well, that suggests to me that John is a man of many parts. And he's going to talk today on a topic we've never, I think, explored before in this group: money, where it comes from, where it's going, and why it's all about faith. John, the floor is yours.
It must be, it's so many other temptations out there. It's very good to have the opportunity to be here in Canterbury for the first time. And the phrase that Doreen very wisely avoided was Cymro Cymraeg, which means Welsh-speaking Welshman. That's where my roots are. So coming this far east, not familiar with it. I did live in Southampton once, but there we go. All right, so this evening we're going to talk about money, where it comes from, where it's going, and why it's all about faith. When I decided to end the day job 5 years ago, I wanted to really focus on things I'd been wondering about for quite a while and poked a bit around and done some reading in, but never had a chance to properly excavate. And one of them was something that we're all totally familiar with on one level, and that's money. We use it every day, but what actually is money? How does it work? And how does faith interweave with it? And it turns out, actually, that those are pretty profound questions, especially if you locate where money is going at this current time. So without any further ado, we're going to click into the slides. We'll have the next one, please, Glenn. I've made far too many slides, by the way. I must apologize. So I will whiz through some of them without saying a great deal. Okay, so the first thing to do is to define our terms. And that's to relate money to wealth. Now just imagine you're Robinson Crusoe, you're on a desert island and you've just dug up some buried treasure. Are you wealthy? No, you're not. And there we are, we have Robinson saying, I have money aplenty, because the chest is full of Spanish doubloons and gold sovereigns and all kinds of different money, yet I live as a pauper. Money and wealth, although we use the term synonymously very often, are two quite different things. Next, please. Specifically, money is a claim on wealth. Or to be more precise, money is best understood as a social claim on future wealth. So if you're living in splendid isolation, like Robinson Crusoe, there is no social dimension to your life. So money is of no value to you at all. So in a sense, money is actually an IOU You know, if you present somebody with some money, you expect them to be able to respond by giving you something that you want. So there's a sort of sense in which money is an IOU. That's why these days it can take the form of a piece of paper or indeed just a number stored in a computer somewhere. Next, please. And here's, just in case you think I'm making this up, this is from the Bank of England Quarterly Bulletin, first quarter of 2014. Money, it says, in the modern economy is just a special form of IOU, or in the language of economic accounts, a financial asset. So that's a crucial thing to realize as we embark on the journey we're on this evening. Money is essentially an IOU. It's a social claim on future wealth. Thank you. So here's a question for you. If we had more time, I'd do a lot of Q&A this evening, but this is the only question I'm going to ask you, and that is simply this. When a bank makes a loan, where does the money come from? Next. Is it deposited in the bank by other people? Is that where the money comes from for the loan? Next. Is it money lent to the bank by the Bank of England? Or could it possibly be created out of thin air by the bank? Anybody want to have a punt at any of those? A. I'm hearing B. Anybody for C? Next. That's a shame, because that's the right answer. And it seems utterly incredible, doesn't it? Next, please. Because what we're looking at here is commercial banks these days, and indeed our central bank as well, practice what's called fractional reserve banking, lending out more money, effectively in the form of IOUs, than they actually hold. And this extra money, the reason they do it, the reason commercial banks do it, the reason commercial banks exist at all, is because they issue money as interest-bearing debt. Interest-bearing. In other words, when that debt is settled, they expect to get more money back than they initially created out of thin air to give to whoever's taken out the mortgage or whatever it might happen to be. And when that money is returned, by the way, to the bank, as it were, when the debt is paid off, it evaporates into thin air just as mysteriously as it was created in the first place. And some 97% of the money that's in circulation in the British economy, and indeed I think around much of the Western world these days, has been created in this way. The exception is cash. Where are we? At no expense at all, I brought my wallet along this evening, if only so I can wave some cash at you, because people don't use cash as much as they used to, which is a shame, because this is a Bank of England IOU, and this is the best possible IOU that you can have. Do you remember a few years ago, back in 2008, when we had the great financial crash, and on the news they had pictures of people queuing around the block to withdraw their money from branches of Northern Rock, which was a fairly new bank that had been created, which was in massive financial difficulties. When we say they were going to withdraw their money from the bank, effectively what they were doing was they wanted to swap their Northern Rock Bank IOUs, which nobody trusted anymore, for Bank of England IOUs, which look like this, which everyone still at this stage trusts. Okay, so only about 3% of the money in our economy these days is in this form, cash and coins, notes and coins, cash. Everything else has been created as interest-bearing debt. It's a number in a computer somewhere by a commercial bank in order to make a profit. Thank you, Glenn. So if you're shocked, you're not alone. So here are some of my favorite quotes about this. An investment advisor called Mr. Angus once said, "The modern banking system manufactures money out of nothing. The process is perhaps the most astounding piece of sleight of hand that was ever invented." J.K. Galbraith, the celebrated economist, said, "The process by which banks create money is so simple, the mind is repelled." And Henry Ford, who gave us the motor car, and this is only attributed, I'm not quite sure whether he really said this, but it's a great quote, so I'll share it with you anyway. "It's well enough that the people of the nation do not understand our banking and monetary system. For if they did, I believe there would be a revolution before tomorrow morning." And you can see why he said that. Next. So the Bank of England was instrumental in the late 17th century in setting the scene for the kind of financial regime which we now operate within and which we take for granted. And it's really all down to this gentleman. That's William of Orange, by the way. Do you remember when certain significant people got fed up with the king that we had, and they deposed him, and they invited the king of a country that we've been at war with 3 times in the previous few decades to come and become our king instead. Okay, he's married to the niece of the previous king, but that was just an excuse. So William of Orange, previously he was a Dutch king, invited over. In 1688, was that the glorious revolution? Thereabouts. Anyway, a few years later, a group of wealthy merchants lent him £1.2 million, a lot of money back then, to spend, as was traditional, on war against France, right? At 8% interest per annum. And in return, the king's creditors, the merchants who'd lent him the money, were allowed to create their own private bank, but with unique public privileges. And that was the Bank of England. Thank you. And here's a quote from David Graeber. David Graeber sadly passed away a few years ago, American anthropologist. His book, Debt, The First 5,000 Years, one of the most important books I've ever read, came out about 15 years ago now. I can't commend it to you warmly enough. Anyway, here's a quote from Graeber's book on debt. The investors, the people who lent the king the money, received a royal monopoly on the issuance of banknotes. What this meant in practice was they had the right to advance IOUs for a portion of the money the king now owed them to any inhabitant of the kingdom willing to borrow from them or willing to deposit their own money in the bank, in effect to circulate or monetize the newly created royal debt. That was a really sweet deal those rich merchants came by then, because they were able to make money twice over through the formation of the Bank of England. Thank you. So I won't go into that. That's the kind of the mechanism by which it worked. I just want to give you a couple of quotes and then point out the key ingredient in this system. First of all, Ryan Collins et al. Point out that what happened when the Bank of England was created was the integration of the state and its creditor class. Essentially, if I may paraphrase, the bankers have been running this country ever since. I'm putting that rather boldly, but I think it brings out essentially what happened at that point. And David Graeber makes the comment that paper money was debt money, and debt money was war money. And this has always been the case. Historically, going way back, rulers, generally, the reason they borrow money isn't because, they're struggling to rub 2 pennies together to pay for the NHS. It's because they want to go to war. And when you go to war, that's expensive, and that's when you borrow money. And that's exactly what happened in the case of William III. Next. And notice that what makes this system work is the fact that the state is able to fund it through taxation. Remember, 8% per annum funded through taxation. The customs and excise people in late 17th century England were really pretty good. And they were very good at collecting taxes of various forms. And because of that, the merchants knew they were going to get their regular 8% cut every year. Because if the taxation system didn't work, the whole system would fall over. Thank you. So the Bank of England notes like this one I've got here still says, I promise to pay the bearer on demand the sum of. So it is a mere IOU. Next. It actually says, so it's the chief cashier who signed it, and he says, I promise to pay the bearer on demand the sum of £10. Actually, when you look at the history of it and how it actually works, what that decodes as, the state promises to accept this token in partial remission of the bearer's tax liability. Because remember that it's the payment of taxes that closes the loop. Without the taxation coming in, the system falls apart. Next, please. So let me just sum up. So money is 3 things I want to suggest to you, basically. First of all, it's an IOU. It's a relationship of credit and debt between people. And if we lived in a very, very simple society where there was no elaborate state and, there was only, Canterbury was still as it was in the early Middle Ages, a few thousand people. And essentially, it would be a very horizontal system where we'd be forever going into debt to one another and then paying those debts off. So it's got that horizontal component to it. Next. But of course, the whole point of it is that you can use money to buy things that are not money. to buy commodities. So money is also a claim on wealth, as we said. And wealth, at the end of the day, is things that you and I practically need in order to stay alive and to keep warm and to clothe ourselves, right? And, to have a bit of fun now and again. So it relates to commodities. And the third thing, as I've just mentioned as well, thank you, is money is whatever the state will accept as tax. So again, it's the state that defines money as a unit of account. It's whatever it will accept as tax. And because of that, that attaches a premium to whatever it is the state has declared to be acceptable as tax. So for example, if the state decided next week that tax was going to have to be paid in Smarties, then you will find that Smarties will certainly become exceedingly popular because everybody would want Smarties, right? And Smarties would become the new money that actually started to be exchanged between people because of the demand of the state and the capacity of the state to impose its will on the population through the exclusive monopoly on the legitimate use of force within the territory which is this country. Thank you. Okay, so let's move on to a bit of theology. And as we know, Jesus talked about money a great deal. And I want to give you just 3 little snippets here of Jesus talking about money. And we'll just say what that tells us about the way money works more generally, as well, obviously, as what Jesus thought about it. So the first is, I'm basing this on Luke chapter 12, the parable of the rich fool. Do you remember the story? A man has an amazing harvest, and he decides, I have to build some more barns to house all the grain that I've harvested, which is great, except that very evening he drops dead. Now, this is an interesting story because what it illustrates is that one of the key functions of money is that it acts as a store of value. Imagine if I had an apple, right, and you were to give me some money for it. Why would I give you an apple, which I can eat and it will keep me alive, in exchange for just a piece of paper or, a piece of card? Why would I do it? Well, I would do it because I believe if I take that bit of paper from you, tomorrow I can take that piece of paper back to anybody else and swap it for another apple, okay? But in order for that to happen, that piece of paper, that unit of money needs to retain its value, needs to be a store of value to some sufficient extent, which is why inflation can be a bad thing and hyperinflation can be utterly disastrous because the function of money as a store of value gets completely cast aside under those circumstances. But Jesus' point here, of course, is that our ability to store value and to be kind of like lords of time, therefore, as it were, is always limited one way or another, if only because the Grim Reaper comes knocking. Next, please. James Buchan, in his very readable book, Frozen Desire, uses that phrase to describe money. Money, he says, is frozen desire. Because as a store of value, money offers the happy prospect of being able to satisfy my future desires, whatever they might happen to be. That's why it's fungible money, which is its great selling point, as it were. And this illustrates money's function as a general equivalent, which can offer gratification for any and every desire indifferently. There's a phrase, isn't there? Isn't my money good enough for you? Well, at the end of the day, though you may not like the person who's wielding that £10 note, it probably is, isn't it? Because money can be exchanged for absolutely anything. Some things that we might totally disapprove of, and yet, because money is the general equivalent, it kind of flattens out the world into a field in which everything is just a different amount of the same thing, essentially. Next, please. And of course, Marx drew attention to the fact that in a capitalist economy, you've got like a kind of a circulation process going on. It's like a bit like the blood supply in your own body. It's like the metabolism whereby the blood circulates in our own bodies. So also in society, in a capitalist society certainly, money has to be in perpetual circulation in order for the machine to not collapse over. Because essentially, in a capitalist society, money is all about making more money. And sometimes that's achieved through an intermediate stage where it's exchanged for commodities. But the net result is that there's profit and there's more money at the end than there was at the start. But in financial capitalism, you cut out the middleman. You don't even need the commodities. You just basically lend money, which is what the banks do. And magically, more money comes back at the end of the day. So money which is simply hoarded under a mattress is no good. It has to be kept in circulation all the time. That is crucial. Next, please. So there's a growth imperative that follows from that. You see, because we are committed for there to be more money tomorrow than there is today, there's a perpetual imperative for economic growth implied by that, if the system is to be sustained. Next, please. Okay, next one. So this is money as state power. Now here, I'm thinking of Mark 12, where some crafty people who wanted to catch Jesus out came up to him and said, should we or should we not pay tribute to Caesar as good Jewish people? The graphics here, by the way, are from the story of Zacchaeus, who was the chief tax collector in Jericho. I couldn't find any graphics for this particular story. But this is a really interesting exchange, this one, and it gives us profound insight into the way in which money still works today. Because what the Romans had done was when they took over Judea, was they introduced their coinage, which was the denarius, a silver coin, across the empire. This is something they did in all the provinces that they took over. And they imposed, and this is the point, they then imposed taxes which were only payable in that medium. So you might have a whole sack full of Jewish shekels, but the tax collectors, people like Zacchaeus, who were having to send this stuff back to Rome, would not be interested. They needed Roman coinage, silver denarii, to pay for that. So and this was, in effect, a mechanism for directing the productive capacity of the provinces towards sustaining and enriching the Roman state. Because if you're a Jewish peasant, how on earth are you going to get hold of these Roman denarii? Well, one way of doing it is instead of, when you harvest your crops, just selling it locally for shekels, you send it off to Rome, who are going to pay you in denarii. And suddenly, Rome has got all this new food coming in because people need the denarii that only Rome can give them in order to pay their taxes. And if they don't pay their taxes, they're in trouble, right? So this is an exceedingly clever scheme for concentrating wealth, real wealth now, not just money, into the imperial core. And it isn't just the Romans who've done this. Next, please. This was a standard practice during the British Empire. And the way it usually worked there was the British administration locally would impose a so-called hut tax on the locals, basically saying, if you live in a hut, which obviously everybody did, then you're going to have to pay some tax in these units of money that we're going to call shillings, shall we say. And the local people in Ghana or in Sierra Leone or wherever it is would say, but we haven't got any shillings, how can you pay this tax? And the colonial administrator would say, well, as it so happens, we have one of our entrepreneurs opening a new plantation down the road, and if you go and work for him, he will pay you in shillings, and you can pay your tax, and we don't have to lock you up. How's that for a deal? Very neat. And it works. It worked. But of course, what it did was it completely reorganized what were previously highly sustainable local economic communities into a kind of a means of being able to direct the real wealth of the colonies back to the imperial core. It works. It's an ingenious scheme. It's got coercion at the back of it. If you don't pay your taxes, you're in clink. But it isn't slavery either. Very clever. Thank you. Yes. So, and here's an illustration of money as state power from, less than 100 years ago, which is very interesting. So we're in Germany. It's the 1920s, hyperinflation. Businesses are going bankrupt all over the place. And in a town called Schwannenkirchen, some local businessmen come up with a clever idea of creating their own currency that they're just simply going to use among themselves, because the national currency, the Reichsmark, was losing value every day. It was just useless as a currency. And this really worked brilliantly well, this introduction of a local currency by these businessmen. The local coal mine was able to reopen. The local economy was revitalized. And other towns in the area started to adopt this currency called the Währer as well. And it was great, except that it didn't suit the Bank of Germany at all. The German central bank came to see the Währer and other local currencies like it, which proliferated around that time, as a threat to the status of the Reichsmark, and so, by implication also, to the authority of the state. So what did they do? They made the Währer illegal. And all that prosperity that was created for those little local communities collapsed. It popped the bubble just like that. So very interesting, the relationship between state power and what's good for people. Interesting point in case. So this just says, yes, so money is the general equivalent. And the thing about the state is, as I mentioned earlier, it gets to define what's the unit of account. It gets to say what it expects you to pay your taxes in. So money has to be countable in order for that. That's a key qualification, because chalk and cheese are as different as they come. I mean, they're proverbially different. And yet you can exchange so many pieces of chalk for a particular weight of cheese for an identical amount of money. So money is the general equivalent, which levels out all these qualitative differences into a difference of pure quantity. Next, please. Yes, let's go through all the bullet points on this. There's a few more. So money, one of the ways in which anthropologists have studied this is by looking at communities in historical times when there was a strong sense that money was kind of like a primordial debt that you owe to society. None of us can live in any effective way on our own. We depend on society. And there is a linkage, a linguistic linkage in Indo-European languages between debt and sin and guilt. So money, for example, in German is Geld. Sacrifice in Old English is Gild. And it's linked to the English word guilt. So it's, in other words, you are always already guilty in the sense of you are always already in debt, and therefore you need money in order to be able to try to level that debt. And particularly in Europe in the first millennium or first millennium after Christ, this notion of Wehrgeld took over. That was worth payment. So if you offended somebody or you committed a crime against them, they began to effectively fine you. And a scale of tariffs was developed according to what you'd done. So for example, it cost 4 times as much to deprive a Russian of his beard as to cut off his finger. One more, please. Thank you. And so there's this different things, qualitatively different things, suddenly become standardized. They become measurable by a single metric, the metric of money. And it's all to do with numbers, really, being able to numerically define the difference between different things. And it doesn't really matter what the unit is. It could be slaves, it could be teeth, it could be cattle and beasts. All kinds of things have functioned as money in this sense over the course of the centuries in different places. It is countability. Oops, let's go back. Thank you. It is countability that transforms the valuable object into money of account. So says Jeffrey Ingham in his book on the nature of money. Yes, next, thank you. Last story I want to allude to that Jesus told was the parable of the unjust steward. And again, we know the story. The steward is in debt, and he goes to his master, and he says, I've got this problem. And he says, if you don't repay your debts, I'm going to beat you up, essentially. So what does the man do? Well, he goes to each of the man's creditors, each of his master's creditors, and he offers them a discount on the amount of money that they owe him. And they say, oh, yeah, I'm having that. If you're going to halve my debts, you're my mate for life. And that's exactly what he does. And so Robert Carris in his commentary says that the rich man was clearly an usurer, right, from a biblical point of view. His credit wasn't an act of charity. It was extended in order to recover a profit in the form of interest. And the steward was authorized to make binding contracts for his master. And what normally would have happened is the usurious interest would not be listed separately on the contract. It would be included in one lump sum. So effectively what happened is that the steward cancels, by his clever bit of chicanery, he cancels the usurious profit of his master. Next slide, please. And because of that, he makes friends. His master's already cheesed off with him. But he knows when he loses his job now, he's going to have a bunch of mates out there who are going to do him some favors in return because he did them a favor by halving the debts that they owed or whatever it was. And of course, historically, usury, the charging of interest on a debt, has been anathema, not only in Christianity, but also within the Jewish community, and also in Islam in a very big way as well. And here's the 1552 Usury Act, illustrating that the charging of interest is a vice most odious and detestable. as in diverse places of the Holy Scripture, it is evident to be seen. And Aristotle also, even, he said, it is not of the nature of money that it should multiply as if it were a living thing. So the charging of interest, that is just weird, man. Don't have anything to do with it. Leave it alone. Let's move on. That practice changed, by the way, of course, as in the early colonial period, because demand for commercial credit began to grow from merchants who could see that there's money to be made by going overseas. But this also, of course, generates a growth imperative. It says this kind of a system means you've got to have an economy which is getting bigger and bigger all the time. Otherwise, again, the thing will just collapse. It'll implode. Next, please. And, of course, in the Lord's Prayer, we pray, don't we, forgive us our trespasses. Or the word that Matthew uses there is the word ophelemata, which means debts, literally debts. That would be the word you would use for a financial debt. It only occurs, interestingly, twice in the New Testament, that word, there in Matthew, and again in Romans chapter 4. So the basic meaning of debts in Matthew's version of the Lord's Prayer is it's that which is owed or which is legally due. And of course, unpayable debt was a chronic problem for many ordinary people in Jesus' day. Though partly the consequence of Roman imperial taxation, it wasn't anything new. And of course, the institution of Jubilee in the Old Testament that we read about in Leviticus and in Deuteronomy is presented as a way of routinely cancelling the burden of unpayable debt which people had accumulated over the course of time. Next, please. Now, you might think that that was just a bit of wishful thinking, this Jubilee practice. But in fact, it turns out that anthropologists and historians have discovered that many rulers across the ancient world were forced to apply wholesale debt forgiveness programs because the social consequences otherwise would have been intolerable. Next, please. And here's a quote again from David Graeber. Sumerian and later Babylonian kings periodically announced general amnesties or clean slates. Such decrees would typically declare all outstanding consumer debt null and void, and return all land to its original owners, and allow all debt payers to return to their families. And it was a regular event, a regular happening in many parts of the ancient world. Next, please. And I love this quote here. In Sumeria, these clean slates were called declarations of freedom. And it's significant that the Sumerian word amargi, the first recorded word for freedom in any language, literally means return to mother. Return to mother, because that's what happened. The forgiven debt payers were allowed to go back to their families. They were no longer effectively slaves having to work for those to whom they had become indebted. Thank you. So in the parable, just finishing off on that, the parable of the unjust steward, the steward effectively converts his master's interest-bearing monetary credit into his own moral credit. His master's debtors become his friends, because unlike interest-bearing debt in a non-growing economy, which is pretty much what the economy was like in Jesus' time, moral debt, which is a favor, essentially, we know favors, that can be discharged with relative ease. And as a consequence, moral debt and credit don't accumulate around particular actors, which tends to happen with interest-bearing debt. Essentially, in a system where the interest-bearing debt is the basic rule of the game, if you're rich, you're likely to get richer. And if you're poor, you're likely to get poorer. Surprise, surprise. So Jesus is commending a gracious economy of freely circulating mutual favor, as opposed to one shaped by profit-orientated usury. Next, thank you. And of course, Jesus goes on to talk about mammon there at the end of that particular exchange. No slave can serve two masters. And the slave will either hate one and love the other, or be devoted to the one and despise the other. And mammon, of course, is a very interesting word. It's an Aramaic word. Nobody's quite sure exactly what it means, but it seems to be related to the notion of trust. So they probably mean something like that in which you trust, or that which has been entrusted. But what Jesus is saying here, in effect, is that what you trust and how you use what's entrusted to you, all that betrays who you really serve. Okay, next, please. And Philip Goodchild, in his, again, very helpful book on money, credit, and faith, he did a trilogy. In fact, this is just the first of them, Philip Goodchild from Nottingham University. He really stresses the central character of trust. The Greek word, of course, is pistis, which normally in the New Testament is translated as faith, isn't it? But actually it could equally be translated as confidence or as trust. It's about an interpersonal relationship. And he distinguishes, does Goodchild, between credit and debt. Normally, when we talk about credit and debt, they're literally two sides of the same coin, aren't they, in that sense? But for Goodchild, credit is the issuing of trust irrespective of any return, which multiplies itself by encouraging expectations of future giving. That's what the slave in the parable of the unjust steward did, in effect. He extended a favor to others in the hope and expectation that in some open-ended way they would return the favor in the future. Whereas debt, in Goodchild's definition, is a simulacrum of trust as contract, the mere giving of assurance as promise prescribing a definite return. So again, this distinction between informal favors that we don't keep an account book at home, I hope. If somebody lends you a cup of sugar, I hope none of us go home and write it down in I owe him a cup of sugar. Obviously, you'll repay the debt when your neighbor needs a favor of some kind. But there's a world of difference between that kind of economy and an economy in which everything is counted, meticulously counted down to the last penny, and an exact return is expected, and on top of that, a prescribed rate of interest. Okay. I'm going to dash on very quickly. I could say a lot more about that. But where is money going? All of that is about where money comes from. But where is money going? And this is an exceedingly salient question for us as people, as well as for Christians, I would suggest. As Christians, I suggest. So this is Philip Coggan, this is. And if you go on the BBC website, I commend this to you. He appeared on Start the Week. Start the Week on Radio 4 on a Monday morning back in 2012. He had a book come out at that time called Paper Promises. Very interesting interview, very enlightening. And in the course of this interview, he says this: the problem is we've created more claims on wealth than we have created wealth itself. That is the problem. Remember, money isn't wealth. Money is a claim on wealth. And he says over the last 40 or 50 years in particular, across the Western world, we've created more claims on wealth than there is wealth out there. Next, please. And we're not going to pay these debts back one way or another. Something negative is going to happen. Next, please. And one of the ways in which debt plays out in the modern world, and it is playing out at the moment in the Persian Gulf, I think, by implication, is all to do with what happened in the early 1970s after American oil production at that point had peaked, and America had just come off the gold standard. What happened was that the American authorities in 1974 sent somebody over to Saudi Arabia, and they made a deal with them. And what they said was this: okay, if you commit yourself to selling your oil in dollars only from here onwards, what we will do is we'll make sure nobody invades you. In fact, we'll sell you some armaments dead cheap, and we'll basically keep an eye on you. But you need to contract that you'll only accept payment for oil in dollars, and, this is the key thing, after you've accepted that payment, we want, because, I mean, okay, by all means, buy a few Cadillacs, buy a few jewels from the States with the dollars that we've just given you, the people have just given you. But after that, if you want to invest your money back in the United States, in other words, lend those dollars back to the US government, that would be really great. And we'll give you some IOUs called treasuries in return. So if we just skip through those. So people buy oil in dollars. Next. The spare dollars get sent back across the Atlantic to essentially lend to the American government. And the American government gives the Saudis a bunch of IOUs, interest-bearing debt. Next, please. And that allows the Americans to buy a lot of stuff from the rest of the world, because everybody wants dollars. Everybody wants dollars because you need dollars to buy oil in this new world that took shape in the early 70s and onwards. And finally, if the rest of the world has got any spare dollars left, they can always buy some American IOUs as well. So this is the petrodollar spigot that the world has been operating under since the early 1970s. Next, please. And as a result, the result of this, of course, is the American government becomes more and more indebted. So this is a chart of American debt that's been normalized to, I forget what I think it's, yes, $2025, I think it is. The American government federal debt now is almost $40 trillion. That's $40 million. And it reflects the genius of Henry Kissinger, or whoever it was who came up with a clever idea in the 70s, of this new economic system whereby a nation can at the same time be the most indebted nation in human history and also be the most powerful nation in human history. Extraordinary, clever system they came up with, whatever you think of it. And that debt isn't going to go down, not if President Trump has his way, who's, in keeping with the tradition of previous presidents, for the most part, he's keen to spend as much money as he possibly can. Right, next, please. But of course, this is under threat, the rise of China. Increasingly, some countries are starting to trade oil, not in dollars, but in other currencies, including the yuan, which is the Chinese currency. So this gorgeous little money spinner that the US has been running since the early 70s is beginning to look a bit wobbly. So I wonder why it is that in the course of the last few months, American military activity has been concentrated around two very large petroleum-producing states, namely Venezuela and Iran. One does wonder, doesn't one? Next, please. And have you heard about stable coins? What the heck are stable coins? Well, I tell you what, they're another way of pushing the can of debt down the road. And this is the really clever thing, because the Americans are really worried that countries around the world are less and less interested in lending the US government dollars. So how can they maintain demand for dollars? Because dollars, they can print dollars, you see, to their heart's content. So the way it works is, thanks to the Genius Act, which came out last year, you and I now could take some money of any currency, we could take it to a company called Tether, which is kind of like a quasi-bank based in the States. Next, please. They will then convert that into dollars, and they will lend that money to the US government. Next, please. The US government will give Tether in return an IOU, an interest-bearing IOU, a treasury bond, and Treasurer will give you a little digital token called a stable coin. By the way, Tether keeps the interest that's paid by the government. You don't see the interest, but you get a stable coin. And their commitment is that you can swap that digital token, which just exists on your mobile phone, really, for a real proper, assuming this was a dollar rather than £10 note, a real proper dollar anytime you can. Now, whether you ultimately that will prove to be the case remains to be seen. But that means that people who live in Argentina or in Zimbabwe, where they've lived with massive inflation and ordinary people simply can't save money because their money is losing value all the time, they want dollars because dollars retain their purchasing power. They are a good source of value. But despite the fact that it's been estimated that most of the actual paper dollars that exist in the world do circulate outside the USA, there's still a massive amount of demand for dollars beyond that. The stable coin is a way of meeting that demand, because you don't need to have a physical dollar anymore now. You simply have to be able to have the right thing on your mobile phone, which says, I own so many stable coins. So they reckon that ordinary people are going to help prop up demand for the US dollar through this, again, this very ingenious system that's been devised. Next, please. Yeah, so in the stable coin is an IOU. I've written a stable coin is actually an IOU of an IOU when you think about it. Actually, I was thinking about it, it isn't even that. It's an IOU of an IOU of an IOU when you actually work out how the system works. So you're beginning to get a sense of, can you imagine in your mind an inverted pyramid, right? And I'll show you a picture in a minute. In fact, we'll come along to that. Let's move on. Next. Oh, shadow banking. Just a quick word about shadow banking. So anybody here got a pension, right? Possibly you have. Well, pension funds are an example of a shadow bank, as are insurance companies and a whole bunch of other players. Imagine you were an old timer living here 200 years ago, and you were short of cash, but you had a gold watch. And you go to a pawnbroker, and you give them your watch as collateral, and they give you some cash. Brilliant. And the pawnbroker thinks to himself, do you know what? Oh, I wish I had more cash, because everybody wants to be pawning their watches. I haven't got enough cash to give everybody. I know what I'll do. I'll go to that bigger pawnbroker down the road, and I will borrow some cash from them. And in order to do that, I will take some of the gold watches that people have already given me, and I will give them to them as collateral for this other loan that I'm going to do. Next, please. And the bigger pawnbroker thinks to himself, oh, gosh, there's so much demand for money. I haven't got enough money. What can I do? I know. Next, please. I'll go to an even bigger pawnbroker, borrow some more money from them, and I'll use the same watches that were given as surety as collateral to the people at the bottom of the pile as a means of being able to extract this funding from the really big pawnbroker. Now, the question is, if the debtor reneges, who gets the watch? Right? There's only one watch there, but it's being passed through all these different hands, right? So that system has been adopted by the shadow banking sector, which includes our pension funds in a very big way. Next, please. And you may remember, some of you, Anne Pettifor. She was very involved in the Jubilee 2000 coalition, going way back now. She's written about this extensively. Next, please. Like pawnbrokers, she says, who practiced an earlier form of unregulated credit, shadow banks exchange the savings they hold for collateral. But instead of watches and wedding rings, they lend out on the strength of government bonds and other securities. Next, please. And these shadow banks can reuse a security to leverage additional borrowing. This is akin to raising money by remortgaging the same property several times. Next, please. The shadow banking system is structurally prone to volatility and debt crises. Okay, next. Right, I'm not going to say anything, we're running short time. Derivatives, I could have spent a whole evening with you talking about derivatives, but derivatives essentially run the world these days. Thank you. Let's go through this slide. Have any of you seen the film The Big Short? It's one of the films they made about the 2008 financial crisis. Yes, let's carry on. Essentially, it's all about making bets upon bets upon bets upon bets. That's how the derivative complex in the financial sector works. And these bets, again, involve certain collateral being posted in order to secure these debt contracts. And exactly as with the shadow banks, collateral is often rehypothecated. It is used several times over, not just once. Next, please. So again, the same watch could be involved as collateral in a whole bunch of different financial transactions. Next, please. So again, if the underlying bet goes wrong, who gets the watches? Who gets the watches? It's not clear who ends up with the watches. There aren't enough watches in the system to match up with all the bets that have been made. Next, please. So in The Big Short, there's a lovely scene in that in a casino in Las Vegas where Richard Thaler, I think it is, who's a world-famous economist, sits down with this attractive young lady who I think is a singer or an actress, and they together explain essentially how the 2008 crisis happened as a result of a mismatch in the derivatives market, exactly for the reasons I've just outlined there to you. Warren Buffett, the famous speculator, described derivatives as weapons of financial mass destruction. And our financial system today is entirely predicated on this. Okay, next, please. Central factor in the crash of 2007, 2008. They didn't go away, folks. Derivatives did not go away after 2008. Next. And one commentator called David Rogers Webb, as I've just said there, the illusion of collateral backing is facilitated by a daisy chain of hypothecation and rehypothecation in which the same underlying client collateral is reused many times over by a series of secured creditors. Next, please. Now, this is serious. This is really serious. You see all these are various measures from 2022, how much money there is in the world. So the one on the far left, the green one, is gross world product. If the world was a household, that would be its annual income, right? That would be its annual income. Well, the amount of the value of the assets that are under management by shadow banks is twice that, or was in 2022, is twice the annual income of the world. And if you look at that tallest column, that is nobody really knows the value of the money that's sloshing around in this derivatives market. The estimation that was made in 2020 was that it was $1,000 trillion, $1 quadrillion, but nobody really knows. It's probably more than that now. So if that was to get wobbly and fall over, there is simply not enough money in the world by an order of magnitude to be able to deal with the mess that was created. as a result of that system collapsing. Next, please. And this is, I told you, imagine an upside-down pyramid. And I find this quite a useful way of summarizing what we've just looked at. So at the bottom of the pyramid, we've got wealth. And above the dotted line, we've got money, which is claims on wealth. So what is wealth? Well, wealth ultimately is land, or if you like, the living biosphere that we totally depend on. If there wasn't a living biosphere, you and I would not be here, full stop, would we? And from that living biosphere, we create various commodities, useful things like food and clothes and gadgets, things that we can buy and sell and which make our lives livable and more enjoyable. So that's wealth. And above that, we have different, if you like, grades of money, different kinds of claims on wealth. First of all, at the bottom, the most secure kind of claim on wealth you've got is this. It's your central bank IOU, which is cash. It's notes and coins. Above that, you've got government bonds. It depends which government. The UK government's been very good. It's always repaid its debts on time and made its interest payments on time. So government bonds, which are government IOUs, that's relatively secure. Then going further up the chain, you have commercial bank deposits, pension funds, and equities. So the money you think you've got in the bank, which you get on your statement every month or whatever, that is money effectively you've lent to the bank, right? And as those people who left their money in Northern Rock found out, if push comes to shove, I'm afraid, if you want them to convert those into cash for you, they ain't going to have enough reserves to be able to do that. So commercial bank deposits, I'm afraid, the money you and I think we've got in the bank, are not as secure as we'd like to think they are. The government has a scheme whereby it will refund you up to £85,000 or something like that. But our pension funds equally, less secure. If you've got stocks and shares, they're less secure. Commercial bonds, which is basically money that companies have borrowed and issued IOUs for, that's even more wobbly. And then on top of all of that, you've got this derivatives complex, which I've just mentioned to you. And as you go up the pyramid, there's more and more claims on wealth coming into play all the time. And all of this is standing on this tiny little base of the natural world, right? And all it would take, you can imagine, is a kind of gust of wind, and this whole thing could fall over very easily. Next, please. And all of that stuff, by the way, is used as collateral for the derivatives market. In the word security, the grade of the security varies hugely. But essentially, if the derivatives market fails, all this other stuff, these are the gold watches. And the question of who gets the gold watch, who gets the cash, who gets the government bonds, who gets the commercial bank deposits, all of that is up for grabs. Next, please. To the extent that an American hedge fund manager called David Rogers Webb began to wonder, how does this all work? And he did a bit of research into the legalities of this, not only in the US, which is where he's from, but in terms of the commercial codes that have been applied all over the world over the course of the last several decades, really. And he came up with a really scary conclusion, and it's summarized in a little book that you can download online. By the way, if you email me afterwards, I will send you a PDF of this presentation, and you can chase down a lot of these sources, which I've itemized at the bottom. He wrote a little booklet called The Great Taking. And what he says is essentially all securities which seem to be owned by the public in custodial accounts, pension plans, and investment funds are now encumbered as collateral underpinning the derivatives complex. What that means is, if the derivatives complex falls over, that money you thought you had saved away, which is going to pay your pension or answer your insurance liabilities, it ain't going to be there, because it will have been reserved for somebody else. And these are probably the big-time banks and big-time financial players. That's where all the gold watches are going to go when this thing falls over. It's now assured, he says, that in the implosion of the everything bubble, which is what we're in, collateral will be swept up on a large scale, and legal certainty has been established that the collateral can be taken immediately and without judicial review by entities described in court documents as the protected class. Next, please. You still haven't waved at me, Doreen. I'm waiting for you to wave at me. Right, okay. Let's just whiz through that. Thank you. Okay. Let's wait there. The point, and very interestingly, in the conclusion, he makes the point that In the past, when the financial system became intolerable, often there was a debt jubilee, as we saw earlier looking at the work of anthropologists. This time he says, no debt forgiveness is intended. And if even partially successful, this will be the greatest conquest and subjugation in world history. It's an anti-jubilee. Basically, all the collateral will go up to the top of the system rather than remain in the hands of ordinary people, to put it bluntly. Next, please. Let's whiz through the CBDC thing. Yeah, carry on. Has anybody heard of central bank digital currencies, CBDCs? Okay, let's whiz on. Blah, 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 blah. So CBDCs, we'll put all these up, and then I'll just say a quick word about them. There's about 3 more bullet points, Glenn. There we go. Thank you. That's great, super. So at the moment, money is cash. Money is also the money you think you've got in your bank account, which is actually a debt owed to you by your commercial bank. Now, this is an IOU from the state. And what they're thinking about doing is issuing a digital form of this. This is the Bank of England issuing it now, right? But in a digital form. And this is what they call central bank digital currencies. And over 100 countries around the world are at an advanced stage of researching how to introduce these CBDCs. Now, the positive thing about these is they'll be much more secure than the money that you got in Lloyd's Bank because they're underwritten by the state. And there seems to be an awareness that our current system is so wobbly, we need to have something to fall back on if the thing falls over. And therefore, having a digital currency which is underwritten by the bank, the central bank, the Bank of England, is seen as a way forward with this. However, there are some serious security implications about this, because with these central bank digital currencies, they're programmable. In other words, the bank can do things with them. So for example, it can monitor all your financial transactions. I mean, people already do that. So when you use your Visa card, Visa knows where all your money's going as well as your bank does. But the state would know it in this case if you have a CBDC. It could impose negative interest rates on your accounts. What that means is you log on to your account to see how much money you've got in there, and you find you've got less than you had last week. I haven't spent any money. Where's that gone? Well, it's because the government have applied a negative interest rate to your account. Why would they do that? Because the economy is stagnant and they want you to spend your money. Right? So and the best way to do that is to take away some of it on a regular basis so that incentivizes you to spend it now when you still got it, doesn't it? And this is a very likely scenario, and you can see the sense of it. You can place expiry dates on any payments that is made to you, limit spending. You can freeze your account in extremis, just like the Canadian government did with the commercial bank accounts of the truckers back at the end of the COVID thing back in 2021. And one commentator says this: CBDCs are not just a matter of technology, but also a matter of political power and social justice. They have the potential to unleash unintended and wanted and unexpected societal consequences. I do urge you to have your ears pierced for talk in the news about central bank digital currencies, CBDCs, because they are at an advanced stage of research in the Bank of England. Let's quickly whiz on. We're almost there. Let's carry on. This is the Bank of England saying we wouldn't monitor your transactions and we wouldn't program your money. We could, but we're not going to do it. Carry on. And this is, yes, the last, let's go back to that one. This corpulent fellow is somebody called Augustine Carstens, and he was, and still is, as far as I'm aware, the general manager of the Bank for International Settlements, which is like the central bank's central bank. And back in 2020, in a speech, he said this: the thing about CBDCs is that the central bank will have absolute control over the rules and regulations that will determine the use of that expression of central bank liability. And also, we will have the technology to enforce that. In other words, if push comes to shove, we, the central banks, will step in and we will take control over your spending because we think we're the best people to do that. Next, please. Thank you, carry on. Basically just saying the world is becoming more authoritarian. So this kind of scenario shouldn't really shock us if suddenly one day something happened and it was imposed upon us. Next. Let me sum up. This is my last slide. What did we learn? I said it was all about faith. money, and I think it is. And let me just point out to you some of the ways in which money is all about faith. First of all, money expresses a faith that my claims on wealth will be honored. Remember, money is not wealth, it's a claim on wealth. And in the same way that if somebody bought a Scottish banknote down to Canterbury and tried to buy something with it, I don't know whether they get away with that. You know, it's a claim on wealth, but would it be accepted? Next. Money also reflects faith that my money will retain its value, which is kind of saying the same thing as the first thing, really. Next. Money in our modern economy is profoundly a statement of faith in a system which is based on endless interest-bearing debt. Do we believe that this system is sustainable? Every time we use money, we say, yes, we do, despite the fact that we've got this inverted pyramid hanging over us, like a sword of Damocles. Next. And the whole derivatives thing is an illustration of our faith in financial innovations. Yes, maybe, you know, we've reached the end of the road with our current system, but some clever people will come up with some more arcane financial instruments which will enable us to kick the can even further down the road. Well, that's a statement of faith. Next. And faith that the state will serve our interests. The state did not serve the interests of ordinary people in parts of Germany in the 1930s because it had its own interests to pursue. Now, we tend to think that the state in a democratic society is on our side, and well, we'll see. We'll see what the next few years have in store. Finally, faith that we are serving the right master, because the financial system that we buy into embodies implicitly commitments of faith, which play out in all kinds of very mundane ways, but which are hugely consequential for the way in which we live our lives. Who or what really are we serving when we use money? And last but not least, the advert. I was very proud of that. I got that from a post. Do you remember those posters from the war, like keep calm and carry on, and you know, be like dad, keep mum? So I went onto a website that had all kind of free pictures on it. I came across this one. This one was originally about not wasting energy, but I was so taken by the image. So the book Maximum Power. If you go to Amazon, it'll cost you £22. Because I'm such a great guy, if you give me £10 tonight, you can have it. I've got several copies out there. And it's not wholly about money. It's about power, actually, although money appears there because you can't talk about social power without talking about money. And anyway, you have to read the book to see what else it says. Thank you very much for your attention and your patience. I've packed far too much in. I would love to hear any questions that you might happen to have. Ooh.
We've 20 minutes or so for questions. Eddie has got a mic. Please wait for the mic to reach you so that everyone can hear your question, including people watching online. Who'd like to set the ball rolling?
Bit of exercise there.
Hello, is central bank digital currency, so is that not going to be for common people like us?
Yeah.
What sanctions are for entire countries that are either starved to death or bombed to death? It's not going to be good, is it?
Yeah, so absolutely. So central bank digital currencies would be for ordinary people and for companies. I mean, the rationale for it is, what happens if the money system collapses and suddenly it's like Northern Rock happens to everyone everywhere? The government would have to step in and maintain some kind of stability. One of the ways they would do it, this is a kind of a hypothetical scenario, is they would issue everyone something called universal basic income. So every month you would get a deposit in your Bank of England account. Actually, it wouldn't be in the Bank of England. They would use agents like to actually hold the money on the Bank of England's behalf, but it would be the Bank of England that was behind it. So they would issue with a certain amount of money every month, and which would enable you to go out and actually carry on living your life, essentially. But the central bank would retain the power to program that money in whichever way it deemed was possible. Now, at the moment, the Bank of England is very emphatically saying two things. We wouldn't program your money, so you can forget about this negative interest rate thing. I mean, we could do it very easily just by pressing this button here, but we're not going to do it. Neither do we want to know where you've spent your money on, what you spent it on. We don't want to know about that. I mean, obviously, our agents, people like Google could be involved in doing this potentially, being the kind of the middlemen between the Bank of England and ordinary people. They will know, obviously, what you spent your money on, but we, the bank, we don't want to know. So you can retain your privacy and all the rest of it. But potentially, you could imagine a situation where it was deemed to be, I don't know, a matter of national security to have a bit more awareness about what certain suspect individuals were doing with the money they were being paid by the state. And of course, if it is simply a gratis pension payment from the state, I mean, whose money is it really? Is it really your money in the same way that the money that you've earned by going out to work is? Or does it actually ultimately, in some moral sense, belong to the state? Because it was the state that gave it to you in the first place. So the CBDC thing, I think, is really interesting. In the States, Trump passed a bill last year alongside I think it was part of the Genius Act, actually, or the Clarity Act, basically saying we're not going to introduce CBDCs, because a lot of people are very wary about it in the States. Unfortunately, this system of stable coins that he's introduced instead could function pretty much in the same kind of a way, because you're still dealing with programmable money, and ultimately it's the government that's sitting behind the tether, which is the stablecoin producer. But do research it. Email me, and I'll send you a PDF, and you can look up all the links. Yeah.
You're very clear about the pointlessness of putting one's savings under the mattress. Had
Yes.
my dear grandfather put his meagre savings under the mattress in the form of sovereigns, to which he had access at the time,
Yes.
I think I might be a rather wealthier person than I now am. Could you comment on why it is that certain commodities outpace every market that one knows about?
Well, just to pick up the point you made about keeping your sovereigns under the mattress, of course, some of us may be aware the price of gold has got very interesting in the last, well, it's gone down again since Iran happened, but it's gone up a lot. And the thing about gold is it acts as a store of value, and there's increasing demand for gold all over the world, particularly from central banks, partly because they're deciding that US dollar IOUs no longer are doing it for them, basically. They're losing confidence in that system. So, yes, having some gold sovereigns around the market, under the mattress is a tempting prospect. And it's interesting to reflect on the fact that back in the 30s, during the Depression, one of the steps that Roosevelt took, who is seen as this great kind of liberal savior of capitalist democracy, one of the things he did was he confiscated everybody's gold. He confiscated everybody's gold because, again, it was about ensuring that the state retained power. And at that point, things were so fraught that part of what that meant was we need all the gold we can get in our own vaults, in the Treasury and in the Federal Reserve, essentially. So, yes, so it is interesting that the normal kind of capitalist logic of money needing to be in circulation all the time in order for it to retain its value, if capitalism starts to creak and cease to function, then suddenly something far more primitive and basic kicks in, like the desire to store value in some medium that you A, trust, and B, have access to. So, yes, gold buried in the garden or under the mattress suddenly looks a less unattractive option.
When you describe the inverted pyramid, and we're illustrated by talking about pawnbrokers.
Yes.
The very first time that the guy passed off the watch.
Oh, yes.
The very first time.
Yes.
Was he being deceptive, or was the third person actually knowing that he doesn't really own that watch? But we'll take it. We'll do it anyway.
Yes. Well, that's a really good question. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the rehypothecation thing is you could argue, thoroughly fraudulent from the ground up, absolutely. But unfortunately, there is a chronic shortage of collateral in the world. There's a chronic shortage of collateral because the thing is, because the amount of debt in the world has grown so astronomically and is growing even as we speak, and that includes commercial debt, personal debt for many people, but also government debt. The only thing that sustains that is having more and more security, more and more collateral going into the system in order to be able to continue the scheme in existence. So there's a kind of like the psychology of this is interesting, isn't it? Sometimes we like to look the other way and pretend something's not happening because the consequences of acknowledging something's happening are just too awful.
I mean, that's really what's happening.
I think that...
Smart people know that this
Absolutely.
is the key.
Absolutely, which is why they're lighting up the CBDCs, I think, because they know ultimately there's going to be a breath of wind which is going to knock over the pyramid, and they want to be ahead of the curve when that happens. Yeah, I mean, finance, I mean, filthy lucre is a common name for money, isn't it? It's always, there's something about money, because it's pure quantity and has no qualitative characteristics pertaining to it, it lends itself to all kinds of dodgy dealings. But yeah, I mean, I haven't got a finance background. I wouldn't be able to give you an account of what goes on in people's heads and hearts here. But again, I think a lot of it is the psychology of simply saying, this is the system, we can't do anything to change it, we just have to go along with it, basically, and hope and pray that we're, not standing in the wrong place when the thing finally goes back.
In the 19th century, my grandmother and my grandfather moved into a small terraced house, and the four little houses have been built for £250.
Yes.
And when my mother moved out of that cottage in 1953, she paid £300 for it. And her total life savings were £100. She borrowed £50 from two relatives, and she got a mortgage from Croydon Council for 10 years for the other £100, repayable over 10 years. When my wife and I eventually sold the property, on her demise and it being left to us, the Croydon Council, because it was being demolished for a road widening scheme, paid the then market value in compensation. And it was then about £6,500.
Oh.
But the reason originally that it was built was because the penny banks had gone bust.
Oh, right.
And businessmen around Croydon said, we will put our money in property
Yes.
because it'll be safe. Is there still some measure of truth in doing that?
Well, yes, I think insofar as people have always want places to live, then, I mean, essentially, if you take out a mortgage, essentially the house that you're living in is the collateral, isn't it? And if you can't keep up your interest payments, the bank will reclaim the house. So there is, this is the unfortunate logic, really, of the way the system works, is that if you want to put your money somewhere safe over the long term, then property is a good place to put it. And the consequence of that, of course, is that people who are trying to get on the housing ladder are going to increasingly struggle to do so because people who've already got money are bidding up the price all the time. So there's one graph that I've got, I haven't got it in this display, which it shows how the price of houses has gone up according to the nationwide Building Society House Index since the 1950s. And I compare it with inflation, and you won't be surprised to learn that houses have increased in value more rapidly than inflation has gone up. But it's actually more or less kept track with gross domestic product, which is basically our national income. So house prices, in that sense, have essentially simply kept pace with GDP. But the other measure that's on that chart is the amount of money that's in circulation in the British economy. And remember, I said earlier that 97% of that money isn't this. It's digital money, which has been created as interest-bearing debts by commercial banks. that curve goes through the roof, particularly since the early 1980s. So, yeah. So in terms of being able to, I suppose, retain purchasing power, putting your money in property has proved to be a very successful way of doing it, despite the fact that it has had adverse social consequences, obviously, in terms of the affordability of housing for others. Yeah.
Thank you. Yes, I'd like to ask you, this is a question about practical theology, really.
Yes.
I'd like to know what we can take from your review of the history of money, these last 3 centuries, to help the church approach the question of social justice at
Yes.
home and abroad. You covered an awful lot of ground in secular sort of economics. In the 1920s and 30s, when the world economy was going berserk, Christian groups did actually come up
Yes.
with a solution. I'm sure you know all about this, though you didn't mention it, which was social credit.
Right, yes.
And they were really rather vague, some of them. They didn't fully understand it, but some did, actually. And it was really those debates, theological to some extent,
Yes.
moral, ethical, which paved the way for Keynes' general theory. They saw the
Right.
problem as one of underconsumption. That's how they saw the economic crisis just after the collapse of 1921-22. They thought underconsumption was the problem. So the solution was to put purchasing power into the hands of the spending public,
Yes.
particularly in the UK. Now, and it was tried, wasn't it, in Canada? With moderate success. It was all a bit wobbly, but actually it did work because basically Keynes refined it all in 1936 in General Theory. Well, that's just an example. What's your sort of take on this, having taken us through this review
Yes.
in 2026?
Yeah, so thank you. That's very helpful to have that point made. And the question of the future of money, I think, is a key one, and what kind of input that Christians can offer into that is very salient. I mean, I do think that although it is a threat to the authority of the state, taking control of our local economies is going to be essential in the future. So local currency is a bit like the Vera that prospered in Germany in the 1930s before it got cancelled, is a super example of the way which local communities can keep value within their local communities. Because we know at the moment, if you go and spend your money in a big national or international store, Tesco or Aldi or whatever, that money leaves the local economy, right? And if what you're trying to do is to produce, as I guess as Christians we'd want to see perhaps, resilient local economies where wealth doesn't seep out into the hands of plutocrats living in the diamond mansions elsewhere. Having some kind of an economic system whereby that wealth is retained locally is really crucial. So there have been many, many examples over the course of the years in developing local currencies, and they've tended to prosper precisely in the kind of conditions you mentioned there, which is the 1930s kind of conditions where the national currency is in short supply. There isn't enough money going around in terms of money that looks like this. So what we do instead is we create a local currency, and often that's been down to particular large employers or large manufacturers locally creating their own IOUs, which are then spent into circulation, which can eventually be recouped by essentially sending it back to where it came from, and goods and services and products being created by the company that originally generated that money. So I think partly, this depends on your theology of what Christian community looks like. And if you take the view that Christian community is first and foremost a local thing, which seeks to preserve the integrity of the life of ordinary people, then I think that kind of a plan has got a lot to commend it. The difficulty with the more grandiose moves towards a central bank digital currency that the Bank of England and other central banks are contemplating is that it would be a massively top-down way of addressing the system, which almost certainly would implicitly safeguard primarily the interests of those in large financial players who have precipitated the mess that we've got into in the first place. So absolutely, I think there's a lot to be said for that. I mean, it's curious, isn't it, talking about underconsumption in 2026 in a world where consumerism has become, for many people, a way of life, and in which spending money that we don't yet have and never will have actually has generated huge amounts of wealth in the short term, but in the long term has created this inverted pyramid, which simply isn't sustainable. So the parallels between our situation now and the situation in the 20s and the 30s is an interesting one, as well as the points of difference, I think. I didn't know we were so late, by the way. I'm sorry. The thing about the clergy is they do bang on a bit sometimes, don't they? Yes, thank you.
I do have sympathy for your sense of Christian faith benefiting the local community. Of course I do. I also have an enormous sense of living as part of a global family.
Yes.
And not many, perhaps in this room, will have had the experience I have of living in a rural community in West Africa and coming back from there and standing in even quite a small supermarket and finding it actually obscene to see the choice of shampoos and cereals and everything else. I can't begin to think that underconsumption is our problem. And looking around at the age group in the room, you will have reflected on what was adequate when you were a child and what we think we require now. But I think I just want to make a comment about living as part of a global family and the needs of people whose circumstances are very, very different from ours.
So in a system of interest-bearing debt, the rich will always get richer and the poor will always get poorer. And that will happen at all different scales, globally as well as locally. Yeah. I mean, that I think is the huge challenge that we've got. We've got a system which is predicated on ever continuing expansion. And if you have a look at my book, there's a chapter in that where I draw the work of some ecological economists who trace this all the way back to the beginnings of settled agriculture and our capacity to do like that chap in the parable did, of accumulating grain. Because as soon as you have hoardable and indeed lootable surplus, that generates a new kind of social dynamic which leads to a proclivity to expand, because you never have enough. That's the point. There's always a proclivity to expand. And whereas essentially the limited availability of energy kept a kind of ceiling on that, since the industrial exploitation of fossil fuels became a reality, of course, that ceiling has disappeared. And that is, ultimately, that lies as the wealth, I'm afraid, of fossil fuels, which underpins the financial wealth that we've come to enjoy across the world. But of course, that is an illustration of the unsustainability of the system, even as the consequences of burning fossil fuels become more apparent, and in any event, the rate of extraction begins to plateau. So that's the other reason, by the way, of course, that Trump is getting all busy in Venezuela and Iran, is that American shale production is pretty much reaching its peak at the moment. But yes, so it's about how do we find a system which is not predicated on interest-bearing debt and therefore on a growth compulsion and expansion compulsion which you simply can't shake off. It's hugely radical, but basic. Very simple as well, actually.
We could probably go on, but we do try always to end at 6:30. So I'm going to ask Martin Pilgrim to propose a vote of thanks.
Thank you, John. A-level economics 60 years ago seems a long way. But that was much more clearly than an economics lesson I've ever received, so thank you. And I'm also interested in your reference to local solutions, because that fits in very well with the theological concept of subsidiarity.
Yes.
And thank you also for drawing attention to the theological and moral dimensions of money. I think that's very salutary for us. I hope you haven't scared too many people with this prophecy of doom and failure. And I have one question, which has usurped my position of giving a vote of thanks. There's a very good article in London Review Books a couple of weeks ago about money laundering. And despite the decrease in the use of paper money and so on, there are trillions of pounds of high-value euros, Swiss francs, and dollars in circulation, and nobody knows where they are or what they're used for other than malign purposes.
Yes.
So that's worth reflecting on. But you've given us all a lot to think about, and thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Just a few notices. As I said at the start, this is our last meeting in our 2026 programme. We are in the process of inviting speakers for next year. And as usual, we'll be meeting on the third Wednesday of each month from January to June. And I am in a position to tell you that our January speaker will be the Reverend Professor David Wilkinson, whom some of you may have heard on Thought for the Day. So that is the 20th of January. We aim to circulate the 2027 programme in its entirety in late November, early December, and I'm delighted to tell you that Wayne has offered to take over as postmaster for us. If you are not on our current mailing list and would like to be, there is a piece of paper on the table in the vestibule for you to sign and put your email address on. As I always say, please write legibly. And then just a couple of other things. If you don't want to wait as long as January, there is an interactive workshop in this church on Saturday, the 4th of July, on travels with Paul round the Mediterranean, which will be led by the Reverend Sue Wone. If you're interested in that, I've put also on the table some old copies of this church's notice sheet, which have details of that meeting and also Sue Wone's email address if you wanted to come, so you could notify her that you would like to come. And then the last notice, please don't forget that on that side of the vestibule, there are copies of John's book for sale at the knockdown price of £10, but because we are maybe not as forward-looking as we should be, cash only.
Cash is king.